Main text of Zhang Ailing's Half-Life Chapter 8. In ordinary families, 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon is the quietest time of the day. Children are all in school, young people are working outside, and only the old, the weak, and the disabled are left at home. This is the case in Manzan's home, with only her mother and grandmother at home. That afternoon, a knife sharpener came to the alley. Mrs. Gu heard him yelling there, so she went downstairs carrying the kitchen knives. After a while, she came up again and shouted loudly on the stairs, "Mom, guess who is here?" "Eugen is here." Old Mrs. Gu couldn't remember who Eugen was for the moment, and vaguely he asked, "Well, who is it?" Mrs. Gu had already walked in with the guest. Old Mrs. Gu took a look and found out that it was Zhang Eugen, the son of her niece's niece, who was once engaged to her eldest granddaughter. Eugen smiled and called Grandma. Old Mrs. Gu was overjoyed and asked, "Why have you lost weight?" Eugen smiled and said, "Maybe people from the countryside always look dark and thin." Old Mrs. Gu said, "How is your mother?" Eugen paused. After a pause, before he could answer, Mrs. Gu said next to her, "My cousin has passed away." Old Mrs. Gu said in surprise. "Ha," Mrs. Gu said, "I saw his sleeves wrapped in black gauze just now." I was shocked. Mrs. Gu looked at Eugen blankly and said, "When did this happen?" Eugen said, "It was in March this year. I didn't send an obituary. I thought that when I came to Shanghai, I'll tell my aunt myself." He briefly told the story of his mother's illness. Old Mrs. Gu couldn't help but burst into tears and said, "How could you imagine it? Old people like us will not die, but she will die at such a young age. In fact, Eugen's mother is also in her 50s. But in the old lady's case, in her eyes, her juniors will always be children." Mrs. Gu sighed. "My cousin is lucky to have such a good son like Eugen." Mrs. Gu nodded and said, "That's right. Eugen, I heard that you have become the director of the hospital. At such an age, it's so light. It's amazing." Eugen smiled and said, "That's nothing. People say, no, 1 in the country, 7th in the city." Mrs. Gu smiled and said, "You are too modest. In the past, you were my uncle. When he was here, he said hello and said that you will definitely be successful when you grow up." "Mom, do you remember?" It was because her husband admired Eugen very much that he betrothed Manlu to him. Mrs. Gu asked, "What do you want to do when you come to Shanghai this time?" Eugen said, "Because the hospital needs to buy some things. I came to Shanghai to take a look." Mrs. Gu asked him where he lived. He said he was staying in a hotel, and Mrs. Gu immediately said, "Then just move here. It's not very convenient in a hotel." Mrs. Gu hurriedly agreed, and Eugen hesitated and said, "Isn't that too troublesome?" Mrs. Gu smiled and said, "It doesn't matter. I'm not polite to you. Didn't you live in our house before?" Old Mrs. Gu said, "What a coincidence. There happens to be an empty room. There is a family living downstairs who just moved out." Mrs. Gu explained to Eugen, "Last year, Manlu got married, and because there were few people in our family, we rented out the 2 rooms downstairs. Until now, they have never mentioned Manlu." Old Mrs. Gu then said, "Manlu is married, you know, right?" Eugen smiled and said, "I heard that. How is she?" Old Mrs. Gu said, "She is finally lucky to meet this person. She's pretty good. Her uncle is quite good at doing business, and now they have built their own house on Hongqiao Road." Old Mrs. Gu always considered it a miracle that Manlu got a rich husband. It could also be said that it was her fault. The most proud thing in my later years, so it can be said in a big way. While listening, Eugen said, Oh, that's good." Mrs. Gu looked at him as he looked a little unnatural, as if he had never forgotten his love for Manlu. If he hadn't known that she was married, he probably would never have come here to avoid suspicion. The knife sharpener shouted outside the back door, saying that the knife was sharpened. Mrs. Gu hurriedly got up and went downstairs. Eugen took advantage of the situation and stood up to say goodbye. The mother-in-law and daughter-in-law insisted on inviting him to live here again. Eugen smiled and said, "Okay, then I will move my luggage tonight. Now I have something to do and I have to go somewhere else." Mrs. Gu said, "Then you should go early. Come and eat." That night, Eugen transported to pieces of luggage from the hotel to Gu's house. Mrs. Gu had already packed up the room downstairs. She smiled and called to her two sons, Wyman, Jimin, come and help carry it. Get something. Eugen smiled and said, I'll get it myself. He carried the box into the room, and the two children followed him, standing and watching from a distance. Mrs. Gu said, This is brother Zhen. Jimin was too young before, so he probably can't remember it. Wyman, you should remember that you liked brother Zhen very much when you were a child. When he left, you cried all day and night, and later you still give Dad a good beating. He can't sleep because of you, and he's angry. Wyman is now a boy of 14 or 15 years old, as tall as his mother. Hearing these words, he couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. Blushing and keeping silent, Mrs. Gu also walked into the room at this time and said with a smile, We will sort things out later. Let's go up to eat first. Mrs. Gu went to the kitchen to serve the dishes, and Mrs. Gu led Eugen upstairs together. Today they had dinner very late because they were waiting for Eugen. Manzin had to go out to teach after dinner, so she couldn't wait any longer, so she filled a bowl of rice and sat there to eat it. Eugen walked in and was stunned when he saw her. In the first moment, he thought he was Manlu, the Manlu from 6 or 7 years ago. Manzin put down the bowl and chopsticks, stood up and said with a smile, Brother Zhen, don't you recognize me? Eugen said embarrassedly. It was because he knew her so well that he looked at her in confusion. He smiled and said, Is she the second sister? I must have seen her somewhere else. I really don't recognize her, old Mrs. Gu said. Originally, when you saw her before, she was not as big as Wayman. Manzin picked up the chopsticks again and said with a smile, I'm sorry, I'll eat first because I have to go out after eating. Eugen saw her filling a bowl of rice, picked up 2 pieces of salty cabbage and ate it there. I feel very unsatisfied. By the time Mrs. Gu brought in bowls of food, Manzin had already finished eating. Eugen said, Second sister, eat some more. Manzin smiled and said, No, I'm full. Mom, I'll let you sit. She stood up, poured herself a cup of tea, and leaned on her mother's chair while drinking slowly on her back. She saw her mother put a chopstick of fried shredded pork with chili peppers and put it into Eugen's bowl, and said, Mom, you forgot, Brother Zhen doesn't eat spicy food. Mrs. Gu smiled and said, Hey, it's true, I forgot about it. Mrs. Gu smiled and said, This kid has a good memory. They never thought that the reason why she remembered it was because she hated Eugen for taking away her sister when she was a child. She knew he didn't eat spicy food, so she rushed to serve him rice and spread some hot sauce on the bottom of the bowl. He always knew it was her prank at the time, but he didn't pay attention to such a trivial matter. And of course he has completely forgotten it now. He only thought it was surprising that Manzin still remembered what he didn't like to eat after all these years. Her voice, smile, every gesture and movement were all so familiar to him. They had been lingering in his dreams over the years, and now they were all in front of him. Fate is really cruel, however. In addition to the pain, the person who has suffered this kind of cruelty will still feel that there is a sweet taste inside. Manzin drank a cup of tea and left. Eugen has always been a little confused. In the past, he was a frequent visitor to the Gu family. They used an old-fashioned bone chopstick with a round top and in the bottom for guests. It was very long and heavy in the hand. He had always used it at their house. This kind of chopsticks is now shared with their family at the same table. Only Manlu is missing. He couldn't help but feel a sense of vicissitudes of life under the dim yellow light. Eugen developed the habit of going to bed early in the countryside and went to bed at 9:30. Mrs. Gu was waiting there for Manzin to come back. Mrs. Gu didn't doze off today. She just sat and talked to her daughter-in-law, talking about various things about her niece's life, and she shed tears while talking about Eugen again. Mother-in-law and daughter-in-law both said that he was good, Mrs. Gu said. So Manlu and his father liked him in the past. Well, we were not lucky and should not have such a good son-in-law, Mrs. Gu said. This kind of thing is also destined. Mrs. Gu said, How old is Eugen this year? He is the same age as Manlu, right? He has delayed his marriage until now. I feel dissatisfied even when I think about it. Mrs. Gu nodded and said, "Isn't it true? My mother only had such a son, and she has not yet gotten married in her early 30s. She must blame us. When she died, she didn't even have a grandson to pay her respects." Mrs. Gu sighed. This child Yujin is too infatuated. The two were silent for a while, their thoughts heading in the same direction. It was Mrs. Gu who was quick to speak and spoke up first. "Actually, Manzin and he are also a couple." Mrs. Gu laughed softly and said, "Yes, it would be best if I gave Manzin to him to repay his affection. Unfortunately, Manzin already has Mr. Shen." Mrs. Gu shook her head, said, "I'm not sure about Mr. Shen's matter. We've known each other for almost 2 years. If this continues, I won't waste his time in vain." Although Mrs. Gu was also a little dissatisfied with Shijin's attitude, after all, he was her daughter's boyfriend. She felt that she had to defend her daughter, so she sighed and said, "Mr. Shen, he is a good person, but he seems to have a bad temper." Old Mrs. Gu said, "Let me say something dirty words. This is occupying the latrine and not taking a shit." As she said this, she burst into laughter. Mrs. Gu also smiled bitterly. On the night of the third day after Yujin came to live in their home, Shijin came. It was already after dinner, and Yujin was in his room. Manzin told Shijin that there was such a person staying with them now. He was a doctor who practiced medicine in a small town in his hometown. She said, "How many doctors are willing to work in such a miserable place? I admire his spirit. Let's go talk to him." She and Shijin came to Yujin's room and asked many questions. Ask him about things in the country, things in the town, everything interests her. Shijin couldn't help but feel an instinctive jealousy. He listened silently, but he never spoke much in front of strangers, so Manzin didn't think there was anything strange about his attitude. When he was leaving, Manzin sent him out and told him about the history of Yujin and her sister, saying, "This was 7 years ago. He has never gotten married. It must be because he is still married, can't forget her." Shijin said with a smile, "Oh, this person is so emotional. He is a passionate seed." Manzin said with a smile, "Yeah, it seems a bit silly to say it, but I think it's his good thing. If a person isn't a little stupid, he won't go to a remote place like that to set up a hospital and do such a thankless job." Shijin said nothing. When he reached the entrance of the alcove, he nodded to her, said briefly "See you tomorrow," turned around and left. After that, every time Shijin came to her home, Yujin was always there. Sometimes when Yujin was in his room, Manzin would pull Shijin into his room, and the three of them would talk together. Manzin actually has a purpose. She recently felt that the two of them were always tired of being together, and the passion was rising day by day. One day they would risk everything and get married early, and she didn't want to do this, so she welcomed a third party to be with them. She can be said to have good intentions, but Shijin certainly doesn't understand. He felt very unhappy. Now the rules in their office have been changed and lunch is provided. They used to go out to eat in a small restaurant together every day. Manzin persuaded him to save money. They always ate in the factory, so there were fewer opportunities to talk. Manzin thought it would be better to be a little more distant in appearance. She didn't know that things like feelings were difficult to deal with. She couldn't just put them in the refrigerator and think that they would last for a certain period of time without deteriorating. On Saturdays, Shijin always came to her house as usual, but this Saturday he called her and asked her to go out. It was Mrs. Gu who answered the phone. She shouted to Manzin, "It's Mr. Shen." They were eating when Mrs. Gu returned to the dining table and casually put Manzin's plate on top of the rice bowl. Otherwise the rice would have gotten cold. She knew that when the two of them called, they would talk for a long time. As expected, Manzin ran out for a long time and still didn't come in. Yujin had been guessing about the extent of her friendship with her colleague named Shen, but now she can find out. He felt a little relieved, feeling that he was really stupid for allowing himself to think like this after only a few days of meeting her. In fact, she already had a lover. Jimin always liked to talk about his school affairs at the dinner table, whether it was someone who had to go to night school or who was fighting with someone. He would always tell his mother in a series of excitement and annoyance. Today he said there that they were going to put on a play, And he also had to play a role in the play, as an old doctor. Mrs. Gu said, "Okay, let's eat quickly." Jimin took two mouthfuls of rice and said, "Mom, you must go and see it. My husband said this play is very meaningful. He picked this script for us. This script is great, famous all over the world." Mrs. Gu ignored what he said. She just looked at his face and said, "There is a grain of rice stuck to the corner of your mouth." Jimin felt very discouraged and felt very sad and happy. He lazily stretched out his hand and wiped it on the corner of his mouth. Mrs. Gu said, "Still there." His brother Wyman said, "He will keep it for snacks." Everyone at the table laughed, except Eugene. He was in a daze here. When they laughed like this, he felt a little bit. I was confused, thinking that I might be acting out of control and doing something ridiculous. He looked at their faces one by one, but couldn't figure it out. That afternoon, Eugene had something to contact, so he went out early and didn't come back for dinner. At the same time, Shijin and Manson also had dinner outside and just came back together. Eugene had just come back a while ago. Shijin and Manson walked past the door of his room and heard laughter inside. It turned out that Jimin was forcing Eugene to show him how to play the role of the doctor. Eugene taught him how to use the receiver and how to measure his blood pressure. Manson and Shijin stood at the door of the room and watched. Eugene couldn't do it anymore and said with a smile, "I know these two tricks, so I'll teach them to you." Jimin just rubbed him. Children always like to change things. In the past, when Shijin taught them to ride bicycles, they were very close to Shijin. Now that they have Eugene, they are much colder towards him. Normally, Shijin might not even notice it, but now he is particularly sensitive. Even the children's love for Eugene makes him a little jealous. Eugene was unprepared and yawned. Manson said, "Jimin, let's go upstairs. Brother Jin is going to bed." Eugene smiled and said, No, it's still early. It's because I haven't slept well in the past 2 days. Now it's almost like I'm a country boy, and I can't sleep because of the noise of cars and trams." Manson said, "And the radio next door is really annoying. It's on all day long." Eugene said with a smile, "It's also because I'm not used to it, because I wanted to find the books to read. I couldn't sleep, so I fell asleep after reading them." Manson said, "I have them over there. Jimin, go up and get them, and get to more books." Jimin walked in with a large stack of books, all of which were on her bookshelf, including the books given to her by Shijin. She inspected each book, handed it to Eugene, and said with a smile, "I wonder if you have seen it?" Eugene said with a smile, "I haven't seen it yet. Let me tell you, I am completely a country boy now, and I don't know where to go until late at night. I have time to read." He stood under the electric lamp and flipped through the pages. Manson said, "Hey, this light bulb is not bright enough. We need to change it to a bigger one." Although Eugene tried his best to stop him, Manson still went upstairs to get the light bulb. Shijin couldn't sit still at this time. He wanted to leave, but he was a little reluctant to think about it. He picked up a book at random and flipped through it. Jimin chattered about his play again and told Eugene the plot. Manson brought a light bulb and said with a smile, "Shijin, help me lift the table." Eugene and Shijin rushed to lift the table and put it under the light. Manson climbed up quickly when they got to the table. Eugene hurriedly said, "Let me do it." Manson smiled and said, "It doesn't matter, I can do it." She stood on the table, twisted the light bulb on the light, and took it off. This house suddenly plunged into darkness. The moment before darkness came, Eugene noticed Manson's ankle. He was standing next to the table and couldn't help but notice it. Her ankles were so slender yet strong, just like her person. In the past 2 days, her mother often talked with Eugene about family affairs. Eugene knew that their family of 7 now relied on Manson, so he thought it was really rare that she could act as if nothing had happened and not have any resentment at all. He found that her interests were different from those of ordinary people. She is really full of energy. Now he even had the feeling that compared with her, her sister was just a shadow of dreamy beauty. The light came on again, and the light was held in her hand and shining on her face. Manson squatted down, jumped off the table, and said with a smile, "Is that enough? But you have to lie on the bed to read." So I'm afraid that's not possible. Yujin said. It doesn't matter. It's the same. Don't bother anymore. Manzin smiled and said, I'll just be a good person and do it to the end. She ran upstairs again and brought a desk lamp. Shijin recognized the lamp, the one in front of Manzin's bed. Yujin sat on the edge of the bed and read a book by the lamp. Does he also feel that the light is particularly warm? Shijin wanted to leave a long time ago, but he didn't want to look angry because Manzin would definitely laugh at him. He also believed intellectually that his jealousy was unfounded. After they get married in the future, if she treats his friends with the same hospitality, he will never object. He may not be so old-minded and so small-minded. But reason being reason, he still found it unbearable. What was especially unbearable was that before leaving, he walked alone into the dark streets, while they were still reunited under the light like a family. Mrs. Gu always looked at Manzin and Yujin with cold eyes. She felt that they could talk to each other very well, so she had some hope in her heart. Seeing that Shijin was not coming soon, she was even more happy, thinking that Manzin must be cold. He did. It was another Saturday afternoon. After lunch, Mrs. Gu spread two newspapers on the table, spread a few liters of rice on the newspapers, and slowly picked out the tears and sand. Yujin sat across from her and chatted with her. He said that he would go back the day after tomorrow. Mrs. Gu felt very sorry, because she said, we also want to go back. There are still a few acres of land and two houses in the countryside. We old ladies are always thinking about going back. I said this to the old lady, talking about your mother, and I said we should go to the countryside. Get some food when we have free time, pick her up and play cards, and we old sisters get together. Who knew she wouldn't be seen? As he spoke, he sighed again. He added, it is a pity that there are no good schools in the countryside, and it is inconvenient for children to go to school. In the future, when they are older, they can live and study. One day, Manzin also got married, and I really went to the countryside with our old lady. Yujin heard her tone, as if Manzin's marriage was an uncertain event in the distant future, so she smiled and asked, isn't the second sister engaged? Mrs. Gu laughed softly. No, she doesn't have many friends, but Mr. Shen comes here often. But Manzin may not be willing to go to someone like this who doesn't know the details. Yujin also heard the tone of her voice, and she obviously liked him. But what about Manzin himself? So does Mr. Shen have completely unrequited love for her? Yujin was a little skeptical. However, people have this temperament, and it is always easy to believe whatever they want to believe. Yujin is no exception. Something stirred in his mind again. This time, the depression in his heart was no less than that of Shijin. Shijin didn't come today, nor did he call. Manzin suspected that he might be sick, but maybe there was something wrong, so he came late. She had been in her room, leaning on the windowsill and looking down. After looking at it for a long time, he walked to the next room without any thought. When her mother saw her, she smiled and said, why don't you go to the movies today? Brother Jin is leaving the day after tomorrow. Please invite him. Yujin smiled and said, I invite. I came to Shanghai. These days, I haven't watched a movie yet. Manzin laughed and said, I remember you used to love watching movies, but why don't you seem to be interested in them now? Yujin laughed and said, watching movies is also addictive. Yes, the more I watched, the more I wanted to watch it. Because there was nothing to watch in the mainland, I quit after 2 years. Manzin said, there is a film you can't help but watch. But I don't know if it's still there now. Is there something going on there? She immediately looked for the newspaper, looking for it, but the one with the movie advertisement was missing. She leaned on the table and lifted up a corner of the newspaper her mother had spread out to pick rice. Mrs. Gu said, these are all old newspapers? Manzin smiled and said, well, isn't this from today? She put the pulling out the newspaper at the bottom. Mrs. Gu smiled and said, okay, I'll let you. I also have to go and have a rest. This time the rice is not good and there is a lot of sand. It makes me dizzy. She packed up and walked out. Manzin found the advertisement for the video in the newspaper and said to Yujin, it's the last day. I advise you to go see it no matter what. Yujin smiled and said, you go too? Manzin said, I have already seen it. Yujin said with a smile, if it's as good as you said, it's worth watching it again. Manzin said with a smile, you've deceived me. No. I'm really tired today. I don't want to go out anymore, and I don't even plan to watch my brother perform on stage today. Yujin smiled and said, then he must be very disappointed. Yujin held a book she lent him in his hand. He read a paragraph every day before going to bed and rolled and folded the book. The cover had fallen off. He smiled and said, look, I see your book like this. Manzin said with a smile, what's the big deal about such a shabby book? Brother Zhen, you are leaving the day after tomorrow. Yujin said, hey, I've been staying for one more week. He didn't say, it's all for you, with these words. He originally planned to wait until the day he left to tell Manzin that if she rejected him, he would just leave. It must be painful to still live in her house and see each other every day after being rejected, but now he thought again. It was a rare opportunity to have no one around. He hesitated for a while and then said, I really want to invite my aunt and uncle to go to the countryside to play. When Wyman and the others go on spring break, we can go together and stay for a few more days. We can stay in our hospital. It's cleaner. You guys probably don't take holidays. Manzin shook his head and said with a smile, it's rare for us to take a few days off a year. Yujin said, can we take a few days off? Manzin said with a smile, I'm afraid, no, we don't have such rules there. Yujin looked disappointed and said, I really hope you can go there. The scenery there is not bad. On the one hand, you can also get to know me better. Manzin suddenly realized that if he continued talking, he might propose to her. Something unexpected happened, she thought. She should stop him quickly. Don't let him say this sentence under any circumstances. It will leave a trace in vain. But even though she thought like this, her heart was beating suddenly. She just lowered her head and slowly pushed some rice grains left on the table to the front and piled them into a small pile. Yujin said, you must be thinking that I am too rash to say these things when I have just met you. I really have no choice. I can't come to Shanghai often, and there will be very few opportunities to meet in the future. Manzin thought, it's all my fault. When he came this time, when I saw him, I remembered how naughty I was when I was a child. He was with my sister and I always made trouble with them. Now that I think about it, I feel sorry for him. He's feeling particularly good. I didn't expect that because I'm sorry. I feel even deeper sorry now. Yujin smiled and said, over the years, I can be said to have been busy all day long, immersed in work, but I don't feel that I am getting old. Since I saw you this time, I feel that I am old. Maybe it's too late to meet you. Is it too late? Manzin was silent for a while, then smiled and said, it's too late, but not for the reason you thought. Yujin paused and said, is it because of Shen Shijin? Manzin just smiled and didn't answer, so she acquiesced. She said this intentionally to mean that she fell in love with someone else first, so she had no choice but to feel sorry for him. She felt that this would less hurt his self-esteem. In fact, even if she met him first and then Shijin, she believed that she would still like Shijin. She suddenly understood now why Xiang Shijin's attitude was so strange and why he didn't come here. It turned out that he had a misunderstanding because of Yujin. Manzin felt very angry. He didn't trust her so much and thought she could change her heart so easily, even if she changed her mind. Didn't Shijin promise her before? He said, I will take you back no matter what. Don't the words he said under the moonlight that night count? He still has his usual passive style. As soon as a third party appears, he immediately walks away quietly without saying a word. This man is so hateful. The more Manzin thought about it, the angrier she became. At this moment, her mind had already flown to Shijin, and she almost forgot about Yujin's existence. Yujin also had mixed feelings at this time. He sat across from her silently. After a long while, he finally stood up and said, I have to go out for a while. See you later. After he left, Manzin felt sad again. She happily took the book she had lent him. The cover is torn. She rolled the book into a cylinder, held it tightly in her hand, and tapped it. It is almost dusk, and it seems that Shijin will not come today. This man was really hateful. She was so angry that she wanted to go out, so as not to worry about him all the time at home and wait for him not to come. She walked to the next room, where her grandmother was lying on the bed because of cloudy weather today. She had some muscle and bone pain. Her mother worked there wearing glasses. Manzin said, "Jimin is acting today. Will Mom go to see it?" Mrs. Gu said, "I won't go. I'm just like Grandma. It's cloudy and my back hurts." Manzin said, "Then I go ahead. Don't go alone. It will disappoint him so much." Her grandmother said, "Where is Brother Zhen?" "You asked Brother Zhen to accompany you." Manzin said, "Brother Zhen is out." Her grandmother said to her face looking up. Her mother remained calm and did not say a word. Manzin also guessed what the two old ladies were thinking. She didn't say anything, just took care of herself, and went to her brother's school to watch a play. Not long after she left, the phone rang. Mrs. Gu went to answer the call, but it was Eugen calling, saying, "I won't be back for dinner. My cousin, don't wait for me. I'm at a friend's house. I'm going to. I won't come back." Listening to his voice, although there was a smile, the smile was very forced. Mrs. Gu knew very well that Manzin must have bumped into him just now. He felt embarrassed, so he moved elsewhere. Mrs. Gu was already sad enough, but the old lady kept asking questions. "Were you staying at a friend's house? What happened?" Manzin ran out alone. "Didn't the two little people have a quarrel?" "Just now. They're fine. I see they are talking and laughing." Mrs. Gu sighed and said, "Who knows what's going on?" Manzin's temper is discouraging. "Anyway, I won't care about her anymore. Shesima dermina farafan tourisane, butamedia telefan tarifsamem, ansan litha wefertef. Themelastamen pretentinten, shanekridan told wear a bear. I didn't know what's going on lately, beauty haven't there free. And a feel fryanesi, shekalad mamla once. Manla sounded levirit, enersens her statistic, slenumata fairfintintas, preferring to gully. She said, "I was supposed to rodom. I single quotes am going to see Mom tomorrow. Double quotes Mrs. Gu was stunned for a moment, remembering that Yujin was living in their house now, so it might not be convenient for Manlu to come. Although Yujinabi duded, ha might be coming back. So happen at them. She hesitated for dwelled. It's not good for Tormom, so just wait for Wagay of an emphasis. Manlu felt free chorused. "Why, Mrs. Gu Calden Saman taunt, so schwasvog." Hare replied, "Well talk about and tear." Them hesitated. The mercury is mimble. She was bred a momo, so she took a cart off era 10 tears. That night, the children of the elephant. The mother-in-law and daughter-in-law wad in her insel. Then sat across for Krifik. Mrs. Gu was startled wendensm. Schle thought she hula flanten. Shenest look adora darentarian and as. She was still a lilitun and what's the materi. Manless Milan said, "Nothing. Ivy always wanted oak. But IWON single quotes TBA called tomorrow, so I single quotes MHE rate a day. Double quotes before she could sit down, Mrs. Gershidler. Eugen Kometo Shana. Didjerma Thurthavi Aleshuli. His mother eyes did, especially for Hakustimum. Huamwevans Werofari, is Morika Pablefer. This time a Hakama be ashing Ramachin for Thalicious. Hedjusternet the Darity. His motheral sodal. Didafton liaphasize. Eiffel Treely Bodwaren 10. Amingtheniuses. Shu the Miss Staff and Texty, Shu walked ahead him. Asa spoke. Sheberston to Tarek. Woof up. Manlu only heard the first 2 sentences, saying that Eugen had come to Shanghai and was staying with them. As soon as I heard these 2 sentences, my ears immediately buzzed, and I couldn't hear the words below. After being stunned for a long time, as if she didn't trust her grandmother, she turned away and asked her mother, "Eugen lives with us?" Mrs. Gu nodded and said, "He went out today and stayed at a friend's house for the night. I'm not coming back." After hearing this, Manlu breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Is that why you told me on the phone not to come tomorrow?" Mrs. Gu smiled bitterly and said, "Yes, I wanted you to come. Now, why don't we meet each other or not?" "It's weird," Manlu said. "That's nothing," Mrs. Gu said. "It seems like it's nothing. It's been all these years, and we are old relatives. I'm not afraid of what others will say." Before he could finish his sentence, he suddenly heard the doorbell ringing. Manlu sat on the chair, couldn't help but bowed took a picture in the opposite full-length mirror, combed her hair, regretting that she was in a hurry when she came out, and didn't even change her clothes. Old Mrs. Gu said, "But Eugen is back." Mrs. Gu said, "No way. He said he won't be back tonight." Old Mrs. Gu said, "It can't be Manzin and the others. It's only after 8 o'clock at this time. They're not that fast." Manlu felt that the air upstairs and downstairs was tense, as if a play was about to begin. But as the heroine, she was not prepared at all, could not remember a single line, and everything in her mind all very vague and indistinct. Mrs. Gu opened the window and shouted, "Who is it?" As soon as she opened the window, 2 or 3 drops of cold rain fell on her face. "It's raining." The tenant's mother also shouted at the back door, "Who is it?" "Oh, it's Mr. Shen." When Mrs. Gu heard that it was Shijin, she immediately became angry, turned around and said to Manlu, "Let's go sit in the room over there. I'm too lazy to see him. It's the one named Shen. I think I'm really angry. If it wasn't for him." At this point, he sighed again, and then told the whole story of what happened. Tell her daughter one by one. When Eugen came to Shanghai this time, because he was not married yet, her grandmother said behind his back that it would be good to marry Manzin to him to repay him for not marrying for 7 years. It seems that he is also very interesting to Manzin, and Manzin is also very kind to him. But just because there is this person named Shen here, Shijin didn't plan to come today. But when Saturday came, it had become a habit to come to Manzin. I held it back all day and didn't come, but it came at night. The stairs were dark. Usually when he walked here, Manzin would turn on the light on the stairs. Today, no one turned on the light for him, so he guessed that Manzin might not be at home. I walked up in the dark, and when I reached the turning point, I suddenly felt the heat on my shins. It turned out that there was a briquette stove on the ground, and there was a pot of food cooking on it. It was not fun to kick it over. He was startled and became more attentive. When I walked upstairs, I saw Mrs. Gu sitting alone under the lamp, with a few old newspapers spread out in front of her, picking rice there. When Shijin saw her, he felt a little uncomfortable. This time, Mrs. Gu always protected her grandnephew because she thought he was Eugen's enemy. So her attitude towards Shijin was very different from before. Shijin had never been treated so coldly by someone in his life. He forced a smile and called out, "Old lady." She raised her head and smiled, making a buzzing sound in her mouth as a greeting, and still picked her rice. Shijin asked, "Did Manzin go out?" Old Mrs. Gu said, "Hey, she went out." Shijin said, "Where did she go?" Old Mrs. Gu said, "I don't know very well either." "Look, are you going to play?" Shijin then remembered that he was downstairs just now and passed by the door of Eugen's room. There was no light inside. Eugen also went out, probably to watch a play together. There was a woman's coat hung on the back of the chair, and a leather bag was placed on the table, as if there were guests here. "Is she Manzin's sister?" I didn't notice it just now, but there seemed to be a car parked at the back door. Shijin was about to leave soon, but he heard the rain outside was getting heavier and heavier. He didn't bring a raincoat when he went out. He might not be able to call a car when he went out. While hesitating, the glass window was not closed tightly, and the 2 windows blew open. Mrs. Gu hurriedly went to close the window, and a door leading to the next room was blown open by the wind. Mrs. Gu was talking there and heard every word clearly. Otherwise, it would be great for her to marry Eugen. Think about it. Then she doesn't need to be so tired. The old lady has always wanted to go back to her hometown, and she is happy with it. Our 2 families are one, but fortunately we are old relatives, so we can't be said to be living together. A woman's voice said something unknown, probably telling her to keep her voice down, and then she chattered inaudibly. Old Mrs. Gu closed the window and turned around, her expression unchanged, as if she didn't hear anything. And she didn't know whether she was a little deaf or pretending not to hear. Shijin nodded to her and said vaguely, "I'm leaving." Not to mention it was raining, but even if it was falling, he would leave. However, no matter how anxious I am, I still have to test step by step when I reach the dark stairs, which breaks my heart. It is absolutely impossible to rush downstairs in anger. Shijin thought in the dark. It's not her fault that her mother is snobbish, originally. It can be said that Eugen's career has been successful and she has a considerable status in society, unlike me who just started working. What will the future be like? Not sure at all. As for Manzin, she admires him very much. But because she and I have a tacit understanding even though we are not officially engaged, she is unwilling to go back on her word. She and Eugen are a bit late to meet each other. Right? Well, I will never embarrass her anyway. He made up his mind and made such a determination. When we got downstairs, the tenant's mother downstairs was still washing rags in the kitchen. When she saw him, she said, "It's raining so hard, Mr. Shen. Didn't you ask them to borrow an umbrella? There is a broken umbrella here. Do you want to hold it?" But this irrelevant old lady and this kind of human warmth made Shijin feel even more desolate in his heart. He smiled at her, then opened the back door and walked into the swaying night rain. Upstairs, as soon as he left, Mrs. Gu went to the next room to report. "He's gone. The rain is so heavy, Manzin and the others will be soaked like a drowned rat when they come back." As soon as the old lady came in, Mrs. Gu said no words were spoken, and the 3 generations of grandparents and grandchildren sat facing each other in silence, only hearing the gurgling sound of rain. Mrs. Gu just told Manlu that she had no scruples at all when telling her everything about Eugen and Manzin, because Manlu herself was already married, and she was married so well that she prospered. And Eugen never got married because of her. Wouldn't it be good to ask his sister to comfort him? Her mother thought she would agree too. In fact, she was shocked and angry. And the most angry thing was her mother's tone, as if they were discussing the next generation's marriage between elders. It was as if she was a complete outsider. This matter had nothing to do with her, and she had no right to be jealous. Her mother was really troublesome. So how did she remember that she had to help her sister get married with Eugen? Didn't the second sister already have friends? This gave Eugen another thrill. She knew that if Eugen really fell in love with her sister, it was because of her, because her sister looked a bit like her. He is still chasing a shadow there. She was very moved. She wanted to see him and persuade him not to be so infatuated. She told herself that she had no other purpose than to meet him and admonish him. But who knows, maybe she still has a kind of unreasonable hope, especially because Honkai is treating her so badly now and her situation is so painful. It was inconvenient to say anything in front of her grandmother. Manlu immediately stood up and said she was leaving. Her mother sent her downstairs and walked to the door of Eugen's room. Manlu turned on the light and said with a smile, "Let me take a look." That was her old bedroom, but all the furniture had been replaced. Now it was temporarily decorated, with a bed, a table, and 2 chairs scattered around. The room seemed empty. Eugen's face towel was hanging on the back of the chair, and Eugen's hat was placed on the table. There were also his fountain pen and a comb on the table. Her mother washed the shirts he had changed, folded them neatly, and placed them on his bed. There is a book beside the pillow. Manlu stared blankly at all this under the light. After not seeing each other for several years, he has become a stranger. She had lived in this room for several years, and it seemed so strange. She felt in a trance, as if she was dreaming. Mrs. Gu said, "He is leaving the day after tomorrow." The old lady said that we should cook 2 dishes as a farewell meal for him. "We don't know if he will come back tomorrow," Manlu said. "His things are all here. If he doesn't come back tomorrow, he will also come to pick up things the day after tomorrow. When he comes, call me and tell me. I want to see him and I have a few words to say to him." Mrs. Gu was startled for a moment and said, "You want to meet again? Okay. Is it okay to let my uncle know about it later?" Manlu said, "I am above board. What are you afraid of?" Mrs. Gu said, "Actually, of course it is nothing. But if my uncle knows, he will find fault again. I'm making trouble with you." Manlu said impatiently, "Don't worry, I won't bother you anyway." I don't know why. Every time Manlu talks to her mother, even though both parties have good intentions, they always end up talking about it, until Manlu loses her temper. The next day, Eugen did not come back. In the afternoon of the 3rd day, he got on the train and had just returned to move his luggage. Manlu didn't wait for her mother to call her. She came early in the morning and had lunch at her parents' house. Mrs. Gu was very worried that day, fearing that their old love would rekindle once they met. The relationship between her daughter and son-in-law had already been cracked, and if this happened, it might break up. My daughter's temper has always been like this. She doesn't listen to others' advice, so there's nothing that can be done to stop her. Wait to follow her. She was not allowed to meet Eugene alone, and it seemed like she was being monitored. It was too obvious. Eugene came and was packing his luggage in his room. When he looked up, he saw a thin woman wearing a purple velvet cheongsam. She didn't know when she came in. She was leaning on the bed railing and looking at him with a smile. Eugene was startled, and then he suddenly discovered that this woman was Manlu. He was shocked again. He was speechless, looking at her, his heart just sinking. He finally smiled and nodded slightly to her, but he really didn't know what to say, and he couldn't find a word anymore. His mind was as empty as if it had been washed away. The two of them looked at each other in silence, feeling that the passing years were flowing there. It was Manlu who spoke first. She said, "Are you leaving soon?" Eugene said, "The car leaves at 2 o'clock." Manlu said, "I must go." Manlu folded her arms and rested her elbows on the bed railing. She lowered her eyelids, stroked her arm, and said quietly, "Actually, you shouldn't have come here. It's a rare trip to Shanghai, so you should have fun. I really hope you forget about me already." Eugene found it difficult to answer her words. She thought he was still there, infatuated with her. He couldn't defend himself either. He paused and then said, "Why did you mention it in those words before?" "Manlu, I heard that you have found a good home, and I am very comforted." Manlu smiled faintly and said, "Oh, I heard what they said. They only saw the surface. How could they know what I felt in my heart?" Eugene didn't dare to speak up. He was afraid that if Manlu continued to talk, she would express her true feelings in detail and it would become a further in-depth conversation. Then there was another long silence. Eugene tried her best to stop herself and didn't look at her watch. He noticed her clothes. She was wearing this purple dress today. He didn't know if it was accidental. Once upon a time she had a dark purple silk cheongsam, and he liked her dress very much. One of Bingshen's novels talks about a sister in purple clothes. Eugene once wrote to her and called her sister in purple clothes. She was the same age as him and 2 months older than him. Manlu looked at him with a smile and said, "You are still like that. Do you think I have changed?" Eugene smiled and said, "People always change, and I have changed too. My temper is different now. I don't know if it's because of my age, but thinking about what happened in the past, it's very childish and ridiculous." He denied everything in the past, some of the memories she cherished. He was ashamed to admit. Manlu was wearing that purple dress and suddenly felt a thorn in her back. My whole body felt like it was on fire. She wanted to tear the dress into rags. Fortunately, her mother walked in at this time, carrying a basket and box, and said with a smile, "Eugene, you didn't come back yesterday. My aunt said she would give you a farewell meal and cook the dishes, but you didn't come back later. I'll keep it for you. You can take it to the train to eat." Eugene was polite. Mrs. Gu smiled again and said, "I'll ask the Liu family's mother to hire a car for you." Eugene hurriedly said, "I'll hire it myself." Mrs. Gu helped him carry the box. He hurriedly said goodbye to Manlu, and Mrs. Gu sent him off. He went out and walked all the way to the entrance of the alley. Manlu was alone in the room, and her tears fell like sand. The room was no different from when she came the day before yesterday. The towel he used was still hanging on the back of the chair, but his hat was missing from the table. She saw all this under the lamp last night, and the warm and friendly mood she felt when she thought about it now felt like it was a lifetime ago. The book beside his pillow was still there, open to a certain page. She didn't notice yesterday that there were several novels on the table. It turned out that they were all her sister's books, which she recognized. The lamp also belonged to her sister. The second sister was really considerate to Eugene. She lent him novels and books to read, and even brought him a desk lamp so that he could read comfortably while lying on the bed. You can imagine her attentiveness. Her mother also encouraged her and deliberately ordered her to bring tea and water. She came to his room with excuses all day long, like the second landlady's daughter, always walking around in front of him and showing off her coquettishness. Just because she is a young girl, no matter how coquettish she is, people still think she is innocent, and her motives are pure. Manlu really hated her to the core of her bones. She is so young, she has a future, unlike Manlu whose life is over. And all that is left are some of her past deeds with Eugen, which are sad but very memorable. But by doing this to her sister, this memory has been ruined and turned into a pile of heart-piercing things that cannot be touched. And it makes her heart hurt just to think about it. Not even this dreamlike memory could be left to her. Why is it so cruel? Manzan himself has another lover. My mother said that the man was already jealous. Maybe Manzan's purpose was to make him jealous. No reason. Just to make her boyfriend jealous. Manlu thought, I didn't treat her wrong. She repaid kindness with hatred. I don't think about who I sold my youth for in the past. If it weren't for them, I would have married Eugen. I'm so stupid. How silly. She could only cry. When Mrs. Gu came back, she saw her lying on the table, crying so hard that her shoulders were shrugging. Mrs. Gu stood quietly beside her and said after a while, Look, if you don't believe me if I advise you, what's the benefit of meeting each other? Isn't it just sad in vain? The sun's rays shone yellow on the floor, and a man who had just left to catch the train made the room look a little messy. 2 old newspapers for wrapping things were thrown on the ground. Mrs. Gu picked them up one by one and said, Don't be sad. It's better like this. You didn't know just now. I was really worried. I think you just happened to be unhappy this time. I'm always angry with my uncle. Don't get excited when you see Eugen. Fortunately, you understand. Manlu didn't answer either. I could only hear her sobs that destroyed her lungs and liver.
Alright, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.